Hey everybody, welcome back. This is All Things Chess with CyberTal. I am CyberTal, also known as John Cole. Thanks for coming back. This is my second video for the channel, so still working the bugs out. It seems like the first one was pretty well received. We're going to continue down by looking through games featured in the Netflix series The Queen's Gambit. This one is a little bit further down the plot hole. By this point, Beth has played in the US Open. I don't want to give away any spoilers, so I won't give away any results, but she played in another tournament after the Kentucky Championship, and then she was invited to an international tournament where some very strong players await her, including the world champion. I won't give the name since that could potentially be a spoiler. But this is essentially her first international tournaments. This is the second round against an unnamed player. And this is, again, sort of a compliment to Gary Kasparov, who's the main advisor for Queen's Gambit. This is a full game. It's completely accurate move by move. There's a little bit of a Zwischenzug at the end, but it's extraordinarily minor. Otherwise, it's just completely true to faith to the game. The game featured was a match in 1958 between Bobby Fischer, he's somewhat well-known, playing the white pieces, playing against Beth Larsen on the black side. We can talk about Bobby Fischer a little bit after I talk about Beth Larsen, but Beth Larsen, in my opinion, really deserves to get a lot more credit and recognition for his contributions to modern chess. After Aaron Nimzovich and his contribution to chess with my system, you don't see a figure like Nimzovich until Ben Larsen comes along. If you play any sort of flank openings like c4 or g3 or b3 or knight f3, or any Indian openings from the black side of the board, most likely you're using some type of idea introduced by Ben Larsen. He completely revolutionized a lot of openings in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But unfortunately, his practical results just never matched his theoretical genius, because he had to play guys like Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer is one of my least favorite world champions. I don't think that's overstating it. I think chess is such an insular community that the flaws of its members tend to be overlooked as long as they play good chess, which I don't think is proper. But Fischer obviously had some struggles with mental health, which is sad. But that shouldn't obviate the fact that he was a miserable human being. He was anti-Semitic, he was delusional, he had bizarre delusions about the Holocaust and world Jewry working against him. He wasn't a nice guy, and I don't think there's really any reason to lionize him other than admitting that he was quite an excellent chess player. But anyways, just an aside. So, as I said, Bobby Fischer had the white piece in this game. He started out with e4. He is notorious for saying that e4 is best by test, which is sort of ironic because the real uptick in his results in the early 70s happened when he finally added moves other than e4 to his white repertoire, but just an aside. c5, this is the Sicilian defense. I would say the best black defense against e4. I've been playing chess for 30 years. I've never once played anything else in a serious game other than c5, which maybe that changed my development as a chess player, but I trust it with my chess playing life. Knight f3, this is strictly main line. d6, also main line. d4, knight f6, knight c3. This is sort of the basic position for quite a many Sicilian variations from here. Black could play knight c6, that would make it classical. Black could play a6, that would make it Najdorf. Black could play e6, that would make it a Skatheningen. But in the feature game, Bent Larsen chooses g6, and this is the Sicilian Dragon. This is sort of notorious in modern chess for being so theoretically loaded that neither side really wants to touch it anymore. It used to be, this game was played in 1958. The line we'll see in this game, the Yugoslav attack, was only just coming into vogue at that time. So you could still play an opening like the Sicilian Dragon with a relatively light theoretical load and still get an interesting position out of it. In modern chess, if you try to play the Sicilian Dragon at a decently high level, you need to have at least 20, 25, maybe 30 moves of theory prepared. And that's sad. I think that's a real blow to modern chess, that there's so much theory required to play at some openings adequately. But you can't stop progress. So g6, bishop e3, bishop g7. Just an aside, this is a very noobish opening trap, but knight g4 gets met bishop b5. And if he plays bishop d7 to block, the queen can take. And the bishop can't take the queen because the bishop is pinned. Just basic opening trap. But after bishop g7, white plays f3. This is sort of the opening line that not necessarily put the dragon out of business, but made it theoretically toxic commodity to handle. Before the Yugoslav attack came along with f3, the dragon had an excellent reputation. It was considered a good aggressive Sicilian variation to play if you wanted to play for a win. But with the introduction of the Yugoslav attack, this is sort of a fundamental test of the soundness of the Sicilian dragon, because it is so aggressive, and it does just immediately go for black's throats. The quote that Fischer is sort of famous for introducing about the dragon was, the Sicilian dragon against the Yugoslav attack just comes down to open the h-file, sack, mate, from white's perspective. And we sort of see a decent example of that in this game. It's not always that easy, but the Yugoslav attack has certainly made the dragon extraordinarily delicate to handle, and made it, unless you're willing to take on the theoretical load, it's sort of a pain to handle. f3 castle, queen d2, bishop c4. Just an aside, that's sort of the super main line. It seems like most theoretical stuff is moving towards castles nowadays, but that's just an aside. Bishop c4 is obviously perfectly fine. Knight x d4. This is an older line, but in my opinion, it's still perfectly fine, especially when I was looking over this game to annotate my comments to prepare for it. Black's really not doing that badly in this line, but just as a quick aside, the modern main line is bishop d7, castle, rook c8, bishop b3, knight e5, and this is sort of a major fork in the road. The crazy, somewhat older theory comes from h4, and then h5 to stop the h-file from getting pried open. This is called the Soltis variation. It was mostly introduced by Tony Miles, English grandmaster that sort of specialized in the dragon in the 80s and 90s. But this just accumulated so much theory, and it became such almost mutually assured destruction for each side that both sides sort of agreed to give that variation a rest. The modern main line, as far as I know, is still king b1. This is what I played when I played e4 when I was younger. This is just a nice, calm, modern move. Basically, the idea is knight c4. And you're almost going to handle this variation positionally now. You're not necessarily immediately going for prying open the h-file. You're taking some time to tuck your king away. It doesn't have the same heavy barrier to entry as does another line with so much theory to it. Just go back. That was just an aside. Next d4, bishop takes, and bishop e6. And this is sort of the main idea of taking on d4 so early, is that you're immediately challenging this powerful bishop on c4. Bishop e3. This is the main theoretical move. When I was looking over and preparing for this game, it is claimed that taking on e6 is bad, but I'm not really sure I believe it. This would be just the basic position where I'd stop. Black's pawn structure is slightly worse than white's, and white even has a little bit better development. So I'm not exactly sure why this is so bad for white. I don't think it is. And especially looking over what white gets out of the opening later in the game, So I think bishop xe6 might be where white would want to start if he wants to do some work in this variation. But bishop b3, it is the main move. It's been played 3 times as many times as bishop taken on e6. So queen a5, this is a standard dragon move, castle, and then b5. The main idea of dropping back to b3 or bishop b3, or one of the main ideas, is that bishop takes b3. White actually welcomes this. And I'll just play another quick move to. So, in this position, each kings are castled on opposite side. White's gone queen side and black's gone king side. That leads to a very aggressive state of affairs, where each side is going to attack the other, and basically whoever lands first wins. The double pawns in the b file actually add to white's king security quite a bit. It makes his pawn structure on the king side almost bulletproof. Now, it could have a poor impact on the endgame when he's trying to queen a pawn instead of defend his king side. But as Taras said, before the endgame, the gods have placed the middle game, where if you get checkmated, your pawn structure doesn't matter anymore. So, that's sort of the basic idea behind this variation, is that when black takes on b3, it's perfectly okay, because it sort of enhances white's king security, and he can attack on the king side with a bit more happiness. So b5, this is another standard dragon idea. King b1. Reason why king b1s are just sort of a standard move in Sicilian. You'll see this a lot. Not necessarily for no particular reason, but just as sort of a quick timeout to enhance your king's safety before you make any other decisions. In this particular position, it has a concrete idea. White might like to play something like knight d5 to try to liquidate some of these aggressive black pieces off the board, but queen x d2 comes with check. So in these sorts of Sicilian dragon positions, a lot of times white will play king b1, and then knight d5 is a threat because queen x d2 doesn't come with check. That's sort of a standard tactical device in the Sicilian dragon. So after king d1 in this position, white is threatening knight d5, so black has to respond. b4 is played in the game. Again, taking on b3, white's happy to see this. It enhances his security on the queen side, and then he's able to play moves like g4, h4, and attack with a lot of peace of mind. b4, knight d5. There's an alternative. Just like the first video, I'll leave my PGN file in the notes. It'll have a bit more full annotation, so you can look at it at your own pace. But knight d5 is the main move. Bishop x d5. Knight x d5 is possible, but it's not the best. So bishop takes, king takes, ed, rook d e1, and this is sort of a basic position we see a lot in this variation. You can modify what minor pieces are on the board and what major pieces are on the board. But basically, in this sort of structure, white's always going to be at least equal and usually a little bit better. Basically, the pawn on e7 for black is weak, and that's just going to be a nice long-term target for white to sort of lean on. Also, black's queenside counterplay really hasn't gone anywhere, so now white finally has time to potentially play h4 and h5 to open up the king side for himself. Knight x d5, not the main move. Bishop x d5 is the main move. Bishop x d5, this is what Fischer played. Probably best is just to take. This will be just an aside that I leave for the PGN note, but a PGN file. But taking with the pawn is probably best to just keep his bishop pair on the board. But bishop x d5. And now Larsen makes probably the first clear mistake of the game. He plays rook a c8. He absolutely has to take on d5, and that's just a clear move. When you have the chance to deprive your opponent of the bishop pair, it is typically advantageous to do so. The bishop pair is an asset in most positions, especially in this position. Because look at the way they're lined up at black's king side. This light squared bishop especially, it's pointed right at the black king, and then the dark squared bishop is right next to it, controlling the squares nearest the black king. Leaving both these bishops on the board would be disastrous for black. So he absolutely has to take on d5. Probably the best move is just to take. Queen takes. Queen takes. And this is just a balanced position. It's completely equal, but there's still plenty of play on the board for each side to work with. But rook a8 is a clear error. Bishop drops back to b3. Really, this all by itself gives white a winning position. White's not up in material. The pawn structure hasn't changed at all. Just this one piece on b3, this unopposed bishop on b3, it becomes such a monster that it influences literally the rest of the game. And in most positions, it's worth more than a rook, at least. It basically makes or breaks the entire position from here on out. So we can make some suggestions for black here and there going forward, but really the main error for this entire game is leaving that bishop alive on b3, because here on out, there's really no good way for black to neutralize it. Rook c7, this is what Larsen played. He needs to get at least one of the bishops off the board, so he probably needs to play knight d7. But I would still take white, obviously, because h4, say take. Probably need to try to get things off the board. Queen d3, something like this. But this is still very, very happy for white, because it's going to take time to neutralize this bishop on b3, which black still needs to do, and that'll give white time to either open up the king side or mobilize the rest of his pieces and do something else. But at the very least, Larsen needed to do that, to at least neutralize one of the bishops. Rook c7 just leaves the whole bishop pair on the board, which is absolutely devastating for his defensive chances. So Fischer goes straight ahead, h4. This is the first part of the formula that Fischer made up, the open the h-file formula. Afterwards comes sack, sack, and mate. Queen b5. This is very slow. Basically, the plan is to play a5 and then a4, but that's a lot of time. And by the time black even conceivably get that in, he's probably getting mated. He can try to play h5, but this is the part of the game where white just switches into sacrificial mode and just goes absolutely nuts. Because it's completely justified, because all of his pieces are properly placed for the attack, all of his pieces are mobilized, black is very passive. When all of your pieces are perfectly placed, it's time to open up the game and go for the kill. I'll leave some of the variations in the PGN file, but just to review the main line that I had for my analysis. Take, h5, gh, queen e3, and that. And that's just one potential example variation, but basically every other variation is like this as well, because white's just completely justified in ripping up the position, because his pieces are perfectly mobilized to do so, and black doesn't have the defensive resources to hold them off. So they're pretty variations, look over them, but all of them are based off the initial premise that when you're well mobilized like white is, it's time to go to work. So queen b5, this is very slow. h5. This move is really the heart and soul of the Yugoslav attack against the dragon. I would even go so far as to say if the Yugoslav attack didn't exist, I would say the dragon would probably be the best Sicilian choice. But because the Yugoslav attack exists, it's not the dragon. h5 is almost always just the correct idea in this position, even if it's a permanent sacrifice, just because you're getting that counterplay against the king side that you're looking for to begin with. Rook fc8, Larsen ignores it. That's probably the best choice. If he plays knight there, yeah. Yep, and this is pretty standard. So knight f. And this is one particular variation where white's light square bishop comes into play. Knight has to drop there to stop the mate threat against h7, and then rook takes g6. The f pawn is pinned, but mate is still threatened on h7, so black has to take. Check. Check. And mate next move. That looks flashy, but again, it's all based off the initial premise that it's time for white to open up the position. All of his pieces are perfectly placed. He's perfectly mobilized. Again, once you're in that situation, it's time to open up the game. After that, it's just sort of the logical conclusion of playing the tactics properly. So Larsen ignores it. He's trying to get some queenside counterplay. H takes. G4. White still needs to be accurate. So one possible blunder is to take on f6. Queen h6. Then e6. And this is a good example of how tenacious black's position can be in the Sicilian. This dragon bishop on f6 sort of prevents mate all by itself. It's not just enough for white to get possession of the h-file. He has to break open the rest of the position as well. Fischer plays g4, which is absolutely correct. He needs to get the rest of his pieces involved. And again, just to point out, look how strong this bishop on b3 is. Like basically the entire rest of the game revolved around black's mistake in letting that bishop live. That bishop is pounding f7, but it's also defensively holding c2, so black doesn't have any counterplay. It is the best piece on the board. I'm including the queens in that. Everything is revolving around how strong that bishop on b3 is. a5 tries to knock it away and get counterplay. g5, knight h5, and here's the classic sacrifice. Rook x h5. This is the second part of the formula, the sac-sac portion before mate. Not to oversimplify, but it's absolutely working in this case. Black can be a lot more tenacious here, though. So black very compliantly takes on h5. He can take on d4, and this is actually... I actually had to do some work on this variation for my notes. And I used a couple of different sources, and I had to analyze some moves that I didn't see looked at in other sources. For instance, Kasparov in his great predecessor series looks at queen x d4, gh, g6, counting on the trying to exploit the pin on the f7 pawn from the strong light square bishop, and he looks at the defensive plan of rook c4, which is absolutely correct, and you can look through the variations. But he doesn't examine rook h6, which I sort of thought was an important move, because this is another way to exploit the pin on the f7 pawn. So just an example, the bishop can drop back to g7, that's the best move. And then queen f4, and this is exploiting the weakness of that f7 pawn by immediately aiming at it. And I don't think black is really surviving this. The variations are complicated. The main line I was looking at was e5, defends the f7 point, knocks the queen away. Queen h4, all he needs is a couple moves to play rook h1 and then rook h8 to checkmate. a4, and then these tactics are basically all working just in time. So rook x g6, a takes b3, rook x g7 check, which is a lightning bolt. And all of this is basically just working just in time. Just to review, if the king takes, queen h6, king g8, rook h1, and that pawn in c2 is actually white's best defensive piece, because unfortunately black can't take his own pawn, and there's no way for black to stop mate coming on h8. So rook xg7, the king has to move to f8. Rook h1. This is a very, very pretty move. It's basically an only move, but it's good enough. Because basically, he wants to get that rook out of the way of the fork that's coming, or that was going to come on c2. So black can take, king c1. And just like the previous variation, white's best defensive piece is black's pawn on c2. Because black can't take his own pawn. So the white king is perfectly happy to just sit there on c1. Black's attack is over. And now white's attack can more or less hit home. He's got plenty of moves in reserve. He's got rook g8. He's got g6 to rip things open. He's got queen h8 and then potentially take on f7. Basically, white is just winning this position. Because black's attack wasn't able to finish white off, whereas white still has plenty of progress to make. So yeah, I was surprised that I didn't see this analyzed anywhere in the literature, because I think it is just not necessarily winning by force, because there's of course room in my analysis to be incorrect, but I think it is just at the very least advantageous for white. So, I mean, if I found a mistake in Kasparov's analysis, cool. Yay. But black was not this tenacious. He very compliantly took an h5, g6, and this is just over, because once again the power of this light squared bishop just screaming down the diagonal. That pawn on g6 is worth at least a minor piece. And again, look at how weak the black rooks are, merely because that bishop on b3 is allowed to exist. Black has no counterplay because of that bishop, and that gives white time to just crash through with the king side. e5, g takes, king f8, bishop e3. White's not even really down material, but he's going to pick up more material along the way. d5 tries to hold him up, but this is completely gone. ed, rook takes f7, d6, rook f6. And strangely enough, this is the point at the end of the game that I was talking about, where for some reason they flip-flop the moves. In the Netflix series, Beth Harmon played d7. In the actual game, Fischer played bishop x f6, and bishop x f6 is slightly more accurate. So I'm very curious to know if something just got past Kasparov, or if that was an intentional change on their part. But angels on the head of a pin, something like that. But in the actual game, Fischer took d7, then queen d6, and Larsen finally resigned. This is sort of it was an excellent game by Fischer. It's sort of a foundational game for how the modern dragon is treated, because it's sort of that basic guidepost for how white plays that mating attack. Larsen could have defended better, but basically that whole plan of h4, h5, sack open the h-file, and then checkmate the black king, it was games like this that sort of codified that in stone and forced black to up his theoretical game to avoid getting finished off like that, which the dragon is still played, but is definitely a very high-stakes opening. I typically try to avoid opening theory. So that sort of theoretical arms race doesn't necessarily interest me anymore. But interesting game. So we're going to continue this series. I might release it tomorrow, but I also have a 15-month-old baby that likes to wake me up, so I might just sleep. I don't know. But thank you so much for your time again. I'm Cybertel, also known as John, and I will see you next time.